Hey guys, we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming this is our last student presentation of the quarter for the Harvard series, which is really exciting for me. I don't know, these guys are extremely accomplished. I'm going to need a notepad in order to introduce them. But they are students, they're in the law school, and they're going to have some really interesting things to talk about in terms of technology transfer and other things related to law and policy around climate change and sustainability. So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited that you're here. Before I introduce Arjuna Dibley Vyoma, there are a lot of snacks, and I think you all should eat them. I actually have plates and napkins this time, which I'm excited about. So with that, I'll introduce our speakers. Arj Dibley is a fellow in the Stanford Program in International Legal Studies and a General Sir John Monash Scholar at the Stanford Law School. He comes to Stanford after several years working on climate change law and policy at one of the world's largest law firms, primarily in the Asia-Pacific region. He's been widely recognized for his work, including winning an award, this is really cool, for being the leading lawyer under 30 in his native Australia. It's a pretty awesome award. Congrats for that. Vyoma Jha is also a fellow in the Stanford Program in International Legal Studies at the Stanford Law School. She holds an LLM in environmental law from New York University and a law degree from the National Law University in Jaipur, India. She's worked with the Initiative on Climate, Energy, and Environment at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi and was a visiting professor at National Law University, Delhi. And she's back to being a student, which is pretty cool. And as a student, she works on climate change law and policy, international trade and investment, and global governance. So please join me in welcoming Arjuna Vyoma.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to turn the timer on because I want to give fair play to both of us. So thanks very much for coming out tonight. And as Andrew said, we're talking about law and policy in the way that it affects the deployment of solar power in India and Indonesia. And I guess, when we talk about climate change in this place, particularly, our minds often kind of race to technology. Some great things are happening around this campus, and I know you guys have had the privilege of hearing from people who are working on issues as diverse as meat substitutes, reducing emissions from the agricultural sector by finding substitutes for meat, or increasing battery life and therefore increasing renewables. But we're taking a slightly different tack, and law and policy is often something which people consider to be quite dry, but it's something that's very important because those technological developments can only be deployed to the countries, companies, and individuals that need them the most if the law and policy settings are correct. And that's certainly something we hope to draw out in the discussion and in the case studies tonight. So I thought I might just start with this kind of weird concept that's included in the title of priority effect, which might be familiar to those in the room who've had some background in biology or ecology. The concept, and I've stated in a pretty basic form, is just that ecosystems are shaped by the priority in which species come to them. And so, if you have a coral reef, let's call it coral reef A, and a fish arrives at that coral reef, the way that reef develops is shaped by the arrival of that fish. You compare that coral reef to coral reef B, where the fish didn't arrive, and you realize that the priority with which species arrive in an ecosystem shape its future development. And that's true in the natural world. It's also true in respect of the way policy develops, and particularly in complex areas like renewable energy. And again, that's hopefully a theme that you'll see throughout the discussion. So I'm going to kick things off and talk about Indonesia, and then Vyoma is going to talk about India, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. And we would very much welcome questions because this is sort of a in-progress kind of research project for us, so we really like to get comments and feedback. So I jumped the gun a little bit, but Does anyone know what this photo is of? United Nations, yeah? Any more specific ideas? There's a bit of a hint up there.
The Paris climate change.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So this was kind of the moment after the gavel landed, and it's the high watermark for international, climate politics. The world came together and agreed that we needed to reduce emissions by well below 2 degrees. And the literature on this talks about the climate agreement as a top-down, bottom-up agreement, which basically just means that this kind of big goal of reducing emissions by 2 degrees is going to be achieved by countries creating laws and policies which help cumulatively to achieve that. So that's the bottom-up part. So I guess the takeaway is that law and policy, as it applies in a kind of a domestic setting, is really important. And the other unique aspect, I guess, of the Paris Agreement is that for the first time in history, it calls upon developed as well as developing countries to play a part in reducing emissions. Former agreements have just focused on those countries which are already industrialized. And so that concept that developed and developing countries should play a role is one that's been quite controversial. Some people see it in this way, and developing countries, I think, rightly hold the view that developed countries have industrialized on the basis that they've had no restrictions on their emissions, and there's some equity issues involved in that. And so the compromise position, as it's kind of captured in the Paris Agreement, is that developed countries will support developing countries. And so in the current context, there's a lot of finance and support available from developed to developing countries. And I raise that only because in the work that Vyoma and I do, thinking about like climate politics and policy as it applies in developing countries, we need to think about the domestic, what's happening there, but also the way that what happens domestically interrelates with what's happening internationally, and what's the way that donors kind of support efforts. And again, that's a theme I think which comes up in both of our case studies. So I'll continue with Indonesia, but just so we're all on the same page, a little bit of basic background about Indonesia. It's a big country, archipelago on the equator. It's the largest country in Southeast Asia, fourth largest by population, and the third largest democracy behind India and the United States. So, large and growing economy. It's the 10th largest in the world, and it's on this list that no country really wants to be on of being amongst the top 10 global greenhouse gas emitters. And what's significant, I guess, about Indonesia is, if I can get this pointer to work, is the fact that it has the highest emissions intensity of any country on that list, which is to say that for every dollar of GDP that's generated in Indonesia, it emits the most emissions to achieve that. So this, this concept of renewable energy is important for Indonesia. Did you have a question?
Just really quickly, so if I buy like a laptop that's made in Indonesia,
Yeah.
And the demand is coming from the United States, who gets the responsibility in terms of emissions, Indonesia or the United States?
The way that the current kind of accounting works is that it's emissions that are produced within the state. So if a laptop is made in Indonesia, then Indonesia is counting those emissions. So with that background out of the way, I wanted to sort of turn now to this. This is a picture of Indonesia, and just for those of you, it's a bit hard to see, but this is sort of the territorial kind of limits of the country. It stretches out here in the eastern part. That's Papua New Guinea. That's Australia down there. The Philippines is up there. Singapore and Malaysia are there, but this whole other area is Indonesia. And this is a NASA photo of Indonesia at night. So obviously the bright spots are light. But what strikes you about this image? Particularly about the light. You know, what do you notice about the location of the light?
Very dense. High density.
It's very dense, yeah. And I think the other point is that it's quite centralized. You know, there's one or two islands here of the 17,000 where most of the electrification is happening, and this is really a reflection of the way that electricity generation happens in Indonesia. Really centralized in this part of the country, but there's very little electrification in the eastern parts of the country. And if you were, you know, a senior sort of, say you're the president of Indonesia and somebody gives you this photo, what do you think, what would you think about this situation of the centralization of electricity? Think you'd feel, you know, good about the status quo or bad, indifferent?
Not too good.
Not too good, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, electrification is obviously tied to economic development. I mentioned before, like Indonesia's the 10th largest economy, but that's because it's got a huge population. If you look at per capita GDP, it's about $3,300 compared to the US, which is 50,000. So it's a developing country, and economic growth is a big part of the policy priorities for people in leadership positions. And so the challenge is, how do you get economic growth and greater electrification out to these parts of the really remote parts of the country in a way that doesn't increase greenhouse gas emissions? That's a really complicated set of priorities. And of course, one really great way of doing that is through renewable energy, and solar power in particular. It's an equatorial country, so this part of the country gets a lot of sunlight. And so, you know, rationally, you look at these kind of priorities together, and as a policymaker, you would probably think solar power is great. It offers this great solution. We can have distributed kind of energy in the eastern parts of the country. And so for that reason, you know, renewables and solar in particular is promoted by the Indonesian president as the sort of number 2 priority for the country. But despite that, you know, there's only 1% of Indonesia's electricity is generated by solar power. And in the last 4 years, the country's had 4 different solar policies. So what I've been looking at is, you know, why is this space so contested? There seems to be really strong rational reasons for having the policy promoting solar power, but, you know, what are the real kind of underlying reasons for its contestation? And I won't obviously talk to all of them, but one I just wanted to touch on was history. You know, history matters, and that kind of ties to this idea of the priority effect, that what happened in the past kind of shapes the development of policy going forward. And so I won't go into the weeds too much on this stuff so that Vyoma can have her fair share, but you know, I'll sort of give you a potted history of I guess, the electricity regulation in Indonesia. So in 1945, Indonesia became independent following, you know, over 100 years of colonization by the Dutch. And at that moment, you know, the sort of the nationalist kind of reformers, the founding fathers of the country, felt very strongly that natural resources should remain in the hands of the Indonesian people. The state of Indonesia should retain control, is the kind of actual language that is in the constitution, of natural resources and the outcomes produced by those natural resources. And, you know, following that kind of legacy, the state set up a state-owned enterprise called the Indonesian Electricity Company to both regulate and generate electricity. So the state-owned enterprise is called PLN. And, you know, Indonesia had a fairly tumultuous political history, but, you know, without going into too much detail about that, basically the country went from being a democracy and then fell under authoritarian rule. The President Suharto was an authoritarian president for 30 years, and he used electricity in a very political way, because he's, you know, while kind of cutting back on civil and political rights of the population, the way that he retained his authority was that he gave people kind of their basic needs. And electricity was one of those basic needs. So he used PLN as a way of ensuring that he could retain his power. And that situation persisted until 1998, when there was a major financial crisis in Asia, the Asian financial crisis. And at that moment, international donors basically had a position of leverage over Indonesia because Indonesia was seeking loans from international development banks. And so the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, offered a $46 billion loan to Indonesia on the premise that they break this monopoly of PLN and get rid of the kind of domination of the state in the electricity sector. And they said, we'll give you the $46 billion if you change the way that, if you basically allow market forces to dictate the way that electricity is generated and distributed. And so Indonesia, accepted that reform, and but I guess what happened in the preceding period was there was also a turn back to democracy after kind of authoritarian rule, and this whole idea of like having market incentives dictating the way that electricity is generated was not one that really won a lot of favour, particularly amongst PLN, which had 50,000 employees, but also amongst certain groups, NGOs and civil society groups, who felt that this looked and sounded a little bit like colonialism in their way of thinking about it, that you're allowing foreign interests to come in and set up and exploit natural resources and so on. And so this coalition of people challenged the constitutionality of the electricity law, and they said, remember that Article 33 that was developed in 1945? Well, this idea that the market should determine electricity prices and so on means that the state isn't in control of electricity. It's the market that's in control, and the Constitutional Court agreed, and this electricity law was overturned. And so that's sort of a potted history, but the key kind of point is that where we're at today is that Indonesia has this, what I call sort of modified liberalization of electricity, where PLN still has a monopoly on the way that electricity is distributed, but there is some opportunity for independent power producers, for independent companies to come into the country and sell electricity. But the other key takeaway is that Indonesia's had this history where, they're clearly skeptical of international interventions in the electricity space, and critical of kind of market intervention in the sector. And so, those kind of principles are ones that have played out again in terms of the way that solar energy has kind of been developed in the country. And so again, you sort of see this idea that, this history of Article 33 and PLN, the politicization of electricity, and these coalitions have shaped the current kind of policy settings. And so to kind of run through this pretty quickly, what happened was, as I said before, the president of Indonesia thought we need to promote renewable energy, we need to promote solar power. So they passed this kind of incentive mechanism, a feed-in tariff, which is basically a policy mechanism to incentivize solar project development, and Vyoma's going to talk about that a little bit more, but the basic point is that it was kind of an incentive for solar developers. And they also introduced this idea of, basically, they introduced a market mechanism for the way that solar, the pricing for solar energy could be introduced. And history repeated itself. In 2014, that idea of having kind of a market dictating the way that solar energy was produced was challenged in court, and that incentive scheme was unwound. The 2013 incentive scheme was unwound. The consequence has been that the state has played more and more of a role in regulating the way that solar energy is produced, to the point where, with my discussions with people in Indonesia, they're of the view that the industry is finished, it's collapsed, and so this was just one obviously snapshot of it, of what's going on in the country. But the point I guess I really wanted to drive home was that the historical context matters a lot for the way that policies developed, and we can kind of come up with these grand international concepts of reducing emissions globally and so on, but the way that translates domestically can be really complicated, and it's really important to consider the history, the historical context of place when kind of designing these interventions. So with that, I'll pass on to Vyoma.
So Arj gave us a nice snapshot into, So Arj gave us a nice snapshot into the sort of deployment and perhaps even the collapse of the solar industry in Indonesia, and just and how that sort of shaped up in light of the historical background of the electricity generation in the country. What I try to do is sort of give you an understanding from the Indian context of how technology transfer can also get constrained. It may not play out in ways which are as simple as just technologies or new technologies, clean energy technologies going from a developed country into a developing country. So the way and the way I will sort of try and show that to you is through this dispute that played out between India and the United States at the World Trade Organization over certain policy measures that India had chosen to sort of proceed with within their national solar policy. And before I get to that, just a little sort of background, or just to give you a little bit of context on where really India stands on issues around climate change, and as well as where India sort of stands within the larger global economic order. Now, it has a very interesting dual position in climate politics, because on the one hand, India has had a very sort of low level of historical responsibility to contributing to the problem of climate change, and yet on the other hand, in the last sort of decade or so, it's one of the sort of highest emitters of greenhouse gases. So, it's sort of straddling this little space of not having the responsibility to do anything because of who has contributed to climate change, and yet, given its current state of emissions and growing emissions going forward, it really needs to step up and sort of take actions and do its part sort of in the global climate change regime. And in the context of energy and the sort of nexus between energy and climate change, also India sort of is, it kind of has a dual outlook to issues, because it's looking at climate change, it's looking at clean energy, and the option to sort of move towards clean energy as a measure to sort of provide energy access to large parts of its population, because they're still not on the electricity grid. They don't have any kind of basic energy access, not even which sort of allows basic sustenance of people. So it has that whole sort of idea or of energy access on one hand, and on the other hand, it's also thinking about energy security. And that's sort of one of the major reasons that it's sort of pushing for clean energy technologies, because that's going to be a big way for India to reduce its sort of over-dependence on fossil fuels and sort of importing oil and gas into the country from other places. And within the international economic order, it's sort of charting this new narrative where it's not necessarily just a host country for investment, but it's also turning into an outward investor. So India is sort of becoming, or it's sort of turning into this, emerging economy, and also sort of gaining stronghold within the WTO regime and issues around trade and investment as well. So in the backdrop of all of this, India had major solar ambitions, which it announced sort of close to the Copenhagen climate talks way back in 2009, 2010. And it announced the National Solar Mission with a pretty ambitious target of generating 22 gigawatts of solar power by 2022. Over the years, it has, at the Paris Agreement, said that 40% of its total energy generation will come from renewable sources by 2030. It has sort of set a renewable domestic goal of 175 gigawatts of installed renewable energy capacity by 2022, of which now the new revised target for just solar energy alone is 100 gigawatts by 2022. So there's almost a 5-time increase from the 2010 ambition to what they announced in 2014, 2015. And just to put that number in perspective of how much energy India is hoping to produce through solar, how much electricity India is hoping to produce through solar energy, is almost half of its current capacity. So its current capacity of power generation is at 278 gigawatts, and it's adding almost half of its current capacity just through solar and renewable energy in the next 7 years.
Vyoma, can you just explain to everyone here the difference between capacity and generation, and the issue of capacity factor with solar, so that people don't have the impression that 100 gigawatts of capacity ends up being literally...
Generation?
That's right.
Okay, so all right. So capacity and generation would be different in the sense that generation would be electricity that goes into the main grid, which then sort of supplies electricity to major parts. But the reason India has a capacity target is because a lot of places in India, and like I said, they don't have basic energy access. So a huge motivator for their entire solar ambition is also to install off-grid solar energies or off-grid solar power, and that they're sort of trying to include within this capacity target rather than generation target, because not all of the solar power that they're going to produce will actually go into the grid, because that's a whole other issue altogether. But the grid perhaps is not large enough to actually supply to all parts of the country, and the grid is also not strong enough to actually absorb a lot of this renewable energy that is being generated. So capacity essentially includes both on-grid as well as off-grid solar power that India is hoping to sort of install. Yeah.
Is this 178, is that per year or per day, or?
Oh, that's I'm not entirely sure of
So,
that.
over what period of time can you get up to a capacity of 278 gigawatts?
But that's it. That is the 278 is the current existing power generation capacity in India. Yeah, and 175 is what they aim to add, like an additional 175 to 278 within the next 7 years.
Just to answer the question, a capacity is the ability of a system to crank out that much electricity at a given time.
Okay.
And then so that's kind of a measure of the metal in the ground. And the issue about how much it actually produces, which is generation, is a function of lots of other things, but that doesn't speak to
energy generation. So feed-in tariffs characterized by 3 main elements, which is guaranteed electricity purchase prices, guaranteed grid access, and a long-term contract. So a combination of these 3 things was promised to renewable energy power developers by a lot of countries across the world. And also within this feed-in tariff was this issue of local content requirements, which essentially meant that they would get these guaranteed prices, purchase prices, and the guaranteed grid access if they purchased a certain percentage of renewable energy goods and use that in the production process of renewable energy, and they sort of ended up sourcing that locally. And it's these feed-in tariffs with local content requirements which have ended up actually being at the heart of certain trade disputes between countries at the World Trade Organization. And the reason for that is primarily twofold. One is because it violates the principle of national treatment, which essentially is one of the sort of core free trade rules, which says that domestic products would not, foreign products would not be discriminated against domestic products, and the other is of prohibited subsidies, which essentially says that any kind of subsidy which is contingent on sourcing goods locally is prohibited under WTO rules, or is prohibited under free trade rules. So essentially, these feed-in tariffs with local content requirements have ended up reaching the WTO. But what complicates matters is that feed-in tariffs or local content requirements within renewable energy policies also has this sort of complicated political economy story behind them. You have the support for LCRs for three primary reasons. One is that it creates clean jobs or green jobs, so it makes these development projects a lot more palatable to local politicians or just people within those constituencies. Second is that it helps foster an infant renewable energy industry as opposed to fossil fuel sort of dominated players in the market. And the third is of course the sort of the co-benefit of achieving climate change mitigation in the process. But the arguments against local content requirements is what sort of ends up taking these policies to the WTO, and that is they are protectionist, they have a negative impact on trade, and they also actually lead to an inflation of power prices because they make electricity produced through these means a lot more expensive than what would otherwise happen if the market sort of operated under freer circumstances. So you have had quite a few renewable energy related conflicts go up to the WTO, of which two have actually ended up going into the panel or the appellate body level, which is essentially the formal dispute settlement at the WTO. One of them was this case against Canada and Canada's feed-in tariff policy. That was one decided case. And there have been several others which there were complaints, but they never really ended up going to formal dispute. They got settled or they're just still pending. And then there was one against the Indian solar mission, which was launched by the United States, and that went to the panel and appellate body. And there was a final report which went against India. So India essentially now has to dismantle that local content requirement within its national policy. And my research sort of focuses on the broader political economy around this dispute. And the reason I decided to look at that was because when the complaint was initiated against India, for India actually having these local content requirements within its solar policy, almost exactly at the same time, India launched a complaint against the United States as well, at the WTO as well, saying that the United States has several states which follow very similar policies in supporting renewable energy within the US. Except that complaint never went to the WTO as a formal dispute until the final decision in this case came out. So the appellate body decided the India solar panel case in September of 2016. And the dates are pretty funny because 16 September was when the appellate body decided this case. And 3 days before that, 13 September was when India launched formal disputes against the US. And that happened a good 3.5 years after it had first filed its sort of complaint against the United States. And that made it really interesting because they had a case against the US, and if it had to be a solar trade dispute, it could have been an equal trade dispute between the two countries. And yet there were several factors which led to India not filing the case, which led to this case playing out in such a long-drawn manner, etc. And that's something that I'm sort of looking at with my broader research. But the main point that I want to highlight here is, and this is something that I have done through several interviews with stakeholders in India, is try to understand whether this WTO ruling actually impacts India's broad and grand sort of solar ambitions. Because on the one hand, India had this, or has this huge target of 100 gigawatts of solar power by 2022, and it certainly hoped that it would create a strong enough manufacturing base for solar energy within India for, energy security reasons, as well as reasons of energy access. But they clearly now have, hit a roadblock with those plans, especially because these local content requirements now have to be removed. So what exactly is the perceived impact of this ruling on India's ambitions, and the first is that India looks at this issue sort of through the lens of both the climate change regime as well as the WTO regime, and there are a lot of barriers to clean technology transfer that India certainly is facing and identifying and highlighting at the UN Climate Change Conference. Now, the climate change regime, also under the Paris Agreement, says that there should be technology transfer of clean energy technologies from the developed to the developing world. But a lot of these face barriers because of the international intellectual property regime under the TRIPS mechanism at the WTO. And that is the trade-related intellectual property rights sort of agreement within the WTO regime, which essentially grants patents and, also like a long time frame for these technologies to be protected under the WTO regime and not allow easy access to these countries. So as a result of these barriers that India sees within the WTO regime, they have sort of moved towards the idea that technology absorption will sort of not happen primarily through technology transfer from the developed to the developing world, but it will happen sort of around domestic manufacturing. So there is this understanding that is emerging from people within the bureaucracy as well as within the market, where they say that at some point we have to sort of create our own domestic manufacturing capacity or capabilities, so that even if we do get new technologies through this technology transfer mechanism within the climate regime or whatever the WTO allows, we need to have domestic capacity which can absorb these new technologies. Otherwise, they're just sort of being dropped into this sinkhole where these new technologies come. There will be these small projects here and there. They'll never be able to be scaled up in these countries because they don't have any domestic capabilities to actually absorb such technologies. And what they now say, or at least post the WTO decision, which has impacted their building domestic capacity through these local content requirements, they feel that, okay, yes, the WTO decision is certainly spelling it out that we cannot use local content requirements anymore, but there is still domestic capacity. I mean, there's still scope for this capacity to be enlarged as long as we are able to create a sort of favorable investment landscape, as well as put the right machinery in place in order to attain these broad solar objectives. And it's here that I sort of call this India's move from unsure protectionism, because the idea of these local content requirements was never necessarily to protect the local industry from foreign players or sort of to give them an undue advantage. It was mainly to sort of help create a small, if not a globally competitive sort of domestic industry, but at least a small industry which had the power to absorb these new technologies that were coming up at a pretty fast pace. So from that sort of unsure protectionism that India was doing through these local content requirements, it's now actually moving to a much more open solar landscape under the Make in India program. And although the Make in India program sounds counterintuitive because it seems like they're forcing you to make locally or buy locally, but the idea is to clear up the sort of machinery, the investment machinery in a way that makes it profitable for more and more solar power companies to actually go and manufacture in India, be they foreign players or be they sort of domestic Indian companies. So they're sort of doing that. And at the same time, you can also witness India's leadership role in promoting and sort of highlighting the International Solar Alliance, which is this new alliance of countries between the two tropics. So it's envisaged as an alliance of countries between the Tropic of Capricorn as well as the Tropic of Cancer, primarily with the idea, with the notion that these are the countries which have the maximum potential for harnessing solar power because of the radiation or because of the amount of radiation that they get. And yet the deployment of solar energy is sort of outside these tropics, which is primarily the developed world. If you look at Europe and North America, and if you look at sort of perhaps Australia, which is a lot more developed than most of the countries within the tropics. So the idea was to get a coalition of these countries together so that they realize their potential for deploying solar energy, and then they could sort of cohere or sort of get together and create a forum which demands aggregation and then drives down prices for solar technologies which, you know, are needed in these countries. And that could also sort of end up creating or sort of, you know, opening up new channels of finance for these projects and getting finance at favorable terms, and also perhaps even collaborate on new R&D and sort of new technologies around solar energy. So there is also sort of that little aspect that you're noticing in the way India is now dealing with solar energy in the aftermath of the WTO sort of case. So I guess in keeping with Arj's main idea of, you know, the priority effect and how any kind of technology transfer, any kind of sort of climate policy which countries are designing, it never really happens in vacuum. You know, it could be influenced by historical forces, such as in the case of Indonesia, which now is proving to be a hindrance for, you know, their plans to advance solar energy. Or in the context of India, it could even be international forces through another regime altogether. You know, because a lot of the constraints that India's solar policy felt was because of this WTO ruling, and in a sense, it has now, you know, led to an almost some sort of a course correction, because, you know, they're changing their whole policy dynamics internally in the aftermath of this case. So, yeah, I mean, just winding up, I guess, if you want to say a few words, it's just that we're thinking of this issue, especially in the solar energy space, as something which cannot really be done independently of, you know, forces that already prevail in these countries, or just forces which are coming from different global regimes, perhaps. And in this case, and in India's case, the World Trade regime. So that's sort of what it is. And I guess just in Arjun's word, designing the climate policy is hard. It's probably a little harder in developing countries, and it needs the help of you know, smart people from all disciplines, really. And climate policy truly is a space where you need to be coming at it from several different angles in order to design anything. And I guess in the case of, and speaking very personally in the sort of India dispute, you know, you have several issues which make it very complicated, because on the one hand, you know, you also have India becoming an emerging, you know, global player in other spaces, but not so much in the renewable energy space. It's always looked at with suspicion that if they move ahead with a policy like this, it must be to protect industry. But everybody in India is pretty self-aware of the fact that the industry is not globally competitive. You know, the motivation of even that minuscule percentage of local content requirements initially was just so that they could create a base which was able to absorb capacities as and when it, you know, changed. And it has been changing very quickly over the last many years now. So you have different motivations for why people move ahead with certain policies, and then they just, you know, don't make the cut. But yeah, in India's case, there was a certain course correction, as I like to look at it. So that's it. Thank you so much. And any questions, I'm happy to sort of take them. And I know you're like maybe a little over time.
Can I ask you guys a question? Just, I know everyone needs to go, but it was a really interesting juxtaposition of presentations, and I just want to say, for the benefit of people, undergraduates particularly sitting here, that one of the things that strikes me from what both of you said is that I think there's a general perception that countries undertake climate policy for climate purposes. And one way to read maybe what you've talked about is that climate is an ancillary effect of policies that countries call climate policies, but that really are undertaken for much more politically immediate, as a result of more politically immediate motivation. So in Arjun's cases in Indonesia, if I heard you right, there's a long history of political battles over electricity regulation, which has to do with kind of haves and have-nots in the country, right, in the notion of foreign control or domestic control. And Vyoma, in India's case, there's this question of made in India or not made in India, and the extent to which renewable energy is going to benefit the domestic economy or not. And so this is called climate stuff, but it's much more complicated than climate stuff. So I'm not trying to preach here. My question is, to what extent do either of you see what you would identify as politically relevant concern about climate change motivating either of these things?
I'm happy to go. Yeah, almost none. I mean, the motivation at a political level in Indonesia is all about electrification and economic growth, and that's quite a deliberate strategy, I think, at the highest levels, because there is no social movement, no one talks about it, there's no Al Gore in Indonesia. You know, that's a good thing and a bad thing, I think, because, you know, it's not politicized, so policymakers can really, you know, they can do a lot without it getting bogged down, and, you know, opposition parties don't feel like they need to, you know, react and take a political position just because, you know, someone like Al Gore is, you know.
So this is a technology that is, the price of which has come down enough where it's now seen economically as a way to turn the lights on.
Yeah, and people see it, I mean, you know, it's seen as a way of achieving development, not as a way of reducing emissions. And yeah, I mean, I think that is changing a little bit, and it's changing because of other areas which are related, you know, to climate change, like forestry, for instance, which it's harder to kind of draw that connection between, like, how is protecting a forest related to economic growth, but people still recognize that's important, and that's kind of creating an environmental movement. But for right now today, I'd say there's next to nothing.
Yeah, I mean, to your question, I think in a country like India, and I think in most developing countries, the issue with sort of straitjacketing any issue as a pure climate policy or just like a climate issue is that there's also still a very, very huge concern over development, you know, and it's still a pressing issue for most governments. Like, you still need to give or sort of provide basic sustainable living to a large part of your population, and that includes energy access. So what has happened in India especially is that the climate discourse has got very closely woven into the development and energy discourse, which is why when I sort of gave you the sort of dualistic position that India has always had, climate change in India now is looked at as an issue which provides both energy access as well as energy security. So it's being couched in different terms because that makes it a lot more palatable to a lot more people. But, you know, in the process, India is also sort of pursuing very big sort of major co-benefits on climate, you know, mitigation through these things. So I guess in the mainstream, most of it is still in the energy of the development discourse, not so much climate change, but that's also sort of changed remarkably, I think, in the last 5 years, I would say. Like, since Copenhagen, since the climate talks at Copenhagen, climate change has really come to the national sort of, you know, consciousness. Like, people are just like that much more aware of it. But of course, I mean, by people I would still say that, you know, it's perhaps the broader intellectual community within cities, not so much within the second-tier cities or villages in India. So there's that disconnect there. But yeah, I mean, I don't personally, I don't see climate change becoming an issue, let's say, in the elections. You know, I don't see climate change being, you know, talked off in the sense of green jobs, etc. But there's a very, very clear understanding now of how to weave in the benefits of climate change into the other sort of pressing, you know, policy needs that you have on the development front, the energy security, energy access front, and just, you know, sort of the broader sort of sustainable development narrative that countries are trying to put in. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, Arjuna, question. So I was fascinated by that map of electrification that you offered, and having traveled a little bit in those regions, Borneo has no people, relatively.
Yeah.
So what's the point of electrifying Borneo?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'll see if I can drag it back up quickly. But there are certainly parts of the country, like you're talking about this sort of area here, which is all.
That's Java down there at the bottom, right?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's reflective of population density. Roughly 60% of the population lives in this tiny part, but there are a lot of people who live up here, and there are a lot of people who live here.
Who have no electricity or relatively low.
Exactly. So, the numbers are like, at 2012 they were roughly 70% electrification in the country, which just means that people have access to 70% of people have access to electricity. But what's clear in this is that they're not getting access to electricity all the time, and at night, it's the way electricity is generated in these parts is mainly through diesel generators. It's expensive, and costly, and noisy, and so people often don't run generators once it gets dark. So
are they building microgrids then, like little
Yep.
solar microgrids in those areas?
yeah, and it's kind of an interesting story because like individually, that they've escaped the attention of policymakers in the capital city, and there's a lot of activity happening. Like talking really small scale. Like one or two solar panels on people's roofs. But in aggregate, I think over time, I think the policy settings, like I said, are a bit of a mess, and it's going to take a long time to work out. But I think that actually, to end on an optimistic note, I think that microgrids and battery technology is really going to change the game a lot because if you can aggregate a bunch of those really small projects, then you can actually get you can get enough generation happening that there can be an uptick. And I think once you start to see that the economics changing as a consequence of aggregated kind of solar, that's going to be the thing that will change the politics, because it's, as hopefully made clear, it's a pretty intractable problem as it exists now.
Just to do a little math, Arj, so just so everyone catches it, the population of Indonesia is 260 million.
Yep.
30% of people are without electricity.
Yep.
So 75 million people are without electricity. What's the population of the United States? Anyone know? 350?
350,
Yeah? So that's 20% of the United States without electricity. And that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And the numbers
Just-
are sort of manifold in India. India has a population of 1.2 billion, and I mean, it's a ballpark figure, I'm not too sure, but at least half the population does not have energy access. So you have close to 500 million people who don't have energy access. So I guess if you're thinking also about new technologies, which these regions of the world would need, the biggest, I think, scope for any kind of technology sort of innovation to happen really is in storage of renewable energy. So even if you have, let's say, a little rooftop panel, or if you have a solar heater at home, you need to figure out a way to make storage better for the energy that this is sort of creating or generating during the day for these people to use, later, or maybe be able to turn off that kind of energy. Because given that there are so many people who don't have energy access, the off-grid solar application is sort of finding a lot of buyers. Like a lot of people are just very interested in actually providing off-grid solar technologies to these parts of the world rather than really bringing them into the grid, because that's just a much more long-drawn and much more complicated process. So energy access is really driving a lot of these technologies, and I think the next big challenge would really be storage and transmission of these electricity, of these kinds of energy. So storage for the off-grid front and transmission for the grid application of such new technologies. Yeah.
Do you guys, I'm sorry if you do have to leave, feel free to leave. Do you guys think that sort of similar policy disputes or legal disputes will come up around these new technologies like storage and transmission? I mean, like, obviously this goes beyond just solar, but I'm wondering if you have any insights into how that might be.
I mean, speaking purely from the WTO front or from that aspect, I think maybe not.
Really?
I don't think it would really go to the level of the dispute. Like in this particular case, the dispute actually was a lot more symbolic than actually primarily in trade grounds or trade interests. But these issues actually are going to come up a lot more in negotiations, not so much dispute. So these issues are actually going to be key to the future climate change negotiations under the TRIPS mechanism of the WTO, which basically decides or figures out what are the patents that would apply to these kinds of new technologies and storage, etc., or batteries, and that is where I think the sort of heated politics would really come to the fore, is at the negotiation level, not so much at the dispute level. And these negotiations could be multilateral, bilateral. Countries, I think, are entering into a lot more bilateral energy-related talks, energy-related discussions, and even sort of forums like the Major Economies Forum, G20, like a lot of these other multilateral talks are now all about energy, like both sort of traditional oil and gas as well as clean energies. So these are actually, I think, in my belief, they're going to pop up there. These issues are going to pop up.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. In Indonesia, I mean, looking at it purely from the lens of this conflict that's happening, I think you'd have a really interesting situation because, part of this dynamic has come about because of the idea that you've got, foreign influence and something that the state should be doing, basically digging up coal and generating electricity from that. Constitutionally, that's what the Constitution says is the state's role. Battery storage changes the game because you've got individuals basically generating electricity from their own rooftops and storing it. And so, in a way, you sort of get around that problem. The dilemma will be, though, I think, when you have people who are generating surplus, and if they wanted at some point to try and start selling that back into electricity grids, then you sort of run into this problem again. But up till that point, I think it's a really it's an interesting question. I'm sure it's one that's going to come up as the technology becomes.
We're
bigger.
sort of running into that here in the U.S. too. Like, what happens when you generate more than you use?
Yeah,
we're still exploring those waters, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's the big problem at the moment, right, with distributed energies. Like, what happens when you get a critical mass everywhere? Like, no one seems to have worked out that dilemma.
Well, thanks, guys.
No, thank you.
Yeah.